Imagine a simple man, a sheep herder and fig tree grower, living in a small, quiet village. He had no titles, was not a scholar of the scriptures, nor was he known among the greats of his day. But suddenly, this ordinary man is called by God to an extraordinary mission, facing kings and religious leaders, denouncing injustices and announcing a divine judgment that no one wanted to hear. This is Amos, a prophet who rose from the anonymity of Tekoa to become one of the most powerful and challenging voices in biblical history. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Amos was born in Tekoa, a quiet village in the heart of Judah. The surrounding scenery was one of vast fields, golden hills under the scorching sun, and fig trees that swayed lazily in the wind. It was a land of shepherds, accustomed to the simple rhythm of country life. In that almost forgotten part of the world, no one would have imagined that there was growing up a man destined to be one of the most challenging voices of his time. From an early age, Amos lived a routine that seemed immutable. He took care of his family's sheep, guiding the herds along the hillsides, always alert to dangers. When he was not in the field, he dedicated himself to cultivating fig trees, especially sycamores, trees that required meticulous work to bear fruit. Young Amos, with calloused hands and a discerning eye, learned to listen to the sound of nature and understand its signals. Anyone who saw him would see nothing more than an ordinary shepherd, perhaps even a bit of a recluse, far from the big cities and their confusion. But there was something special about Amos, even if he didn't know it yet. His eyes carried a restlessness, a keen awareness of the injustices that sometimes reached even the most remote corners of Tekoa. When he heard the stories that travelers brought about Samaria and its riches, about the oppression of the poor and the greed of the rich, he felt something different, an indignation that would not leave him alone. As the world continued its course, a greater voice, silent but unmistakable, began to form within him. It was as if the wind that blew over the hills carried with it a divine whisper, a call that he still did not fully understand. Until one day, that silence was broken, and in a way that Amos would never have imagined. That day seemed like all the others. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, turning the sky orange and gold as Amos led his flock up the hillsides. The sound of sheep bells mingled with the rustling of leaves and the shy song of birds. Everything seemed so calm, so predictable, but something was about to happen. Something that would forever change that man's trajectory. It was while he was alone, watching the sheep graze, that Amos felt the calling. It wasn't an ordinary voice, the kind we hear and respond with words. It was more like a weight on his heart, a heat that rose up his spine and seemed to fill his entire being. It was as if the wind that blew through the trees was charged with something beyond simple air, a presence, an urgency. Amos, who had never considered himself special, realized that God was speaking to him. God did not call him to a small task. He, a simple man, accustomed to the silence of the fields and working with his hands, was sent to speak in the name of the Creator himself. And it wouldn't be an easy message. Amos should go to the kingdom of Israel, to the north, and confront the powerful with harsh words. He should denounce the injustices, greed, and corruption that reigned there. Imagine the weight of this mission. An anonymous pastor, without titles or status, being sent to confront kings and priests. Amos knew it would be a difficult path. He had no preparation, no eloquence. "I'm just a cowboy," you may have thought. But there was no room to refuse. When God calls, even the simplest of men are capable of great things. Amos left the fields of Tekoa behind and began his journey north, not knowing exactly what he would find. The kingdom of Israel awaited him, prosperous on the outside, but rotten on the inside. And Amos carried the message that would be like thunder, breaking the false silence of that place. The road to the kingdom of Israel was long and full of uncertainty. Amos walked, taking with him only what he needed: his staff, his accumulated experience in the fields, and the conviction that he was obeying God's call. As it approached, the reports about Israel became clearer and more disturbing. The kingdom was prosperous, more than Judah could imagine. The cities were full of luxurious palaces, bustling markets, and grand parties. But behind this apparent shine, Amos heard stories of oppression, corruption, and an empty religion that served more as spectacle than as devotion. When he arrived, the contrast struck him. Samaria, the capital, glittered with the ostentation of the rich. The main streets were a parade of fine fabrics, sparkling jewelry, and laughter from those who seemed to have it all. But all you had to do was look into the most hidden alleys, and you would see another reality. Poor people crushed by poverty, slaves overworked, and hungry children. Amos didn't need long to realize what was wrong. The rich lived as if nothing could touch them, taking advantage of the hard work of the less fortunate. Justice, which should be a right for everyone, had become a privilege for a few. Religion, which was supposed to be the moral foundation of the people, was a sham. Altars were full of expensive offerings, but hearts were empty of repentance. The people of Israel had turned away from God, exchanging true worship for pompous and convenient rituals. Amos saw all this and felt that his message would not only be difficult to hear, it would be like a cutting blade, exposed before a people who preferred to close their eyes. As he walked through the streets of Samaria, listening to the hustle and bustle of the marketplaces and the songs coming from the temples, Amos knew his moment was coming. He didn't know exactly how or when he would begin, but one thing was certain: his voice, full of truth, would soon echo like thunder in the palaces and squares of that prosperous but morally sick kingdom. The opportunity to speak came faster than Amos expected. He was in Samaria, surrounded by the opulence of the city, when he began to proclaim his message. There were no ceremonies, no elaborate preparations. Amos simply raised his voice, and it was as if the sky itself roared. He began with words that no one could ignore. "The Lord will roar from Zion, and he will make his voice heard from Jerusalem." It was like thunder, cutting through the air. Those passing by stopped to listen, more out of curiosity than out of reverence. After all, who was that man dressed like a shepherd, daring to speak with so much authority? Amos's words were direct, blunt. He spoke about neighboring nations, condemning their injustices and cruelties. The people of Israel listened with some satisfaction, because it seemed like he was attacking their enemies. But then, like the roar of a lion changing direction, Amos pointed his finger at Israel. His voice became even more intense, more urgent. He began to denounce the rich who exploited the poor, the leaders who turned justice into a commodity, the priests who turned religion into theater. "You who crush the poor and demand grain tribute have built luxurious houses, but you will not live in them. They will plant beautiful vineyards, but they will not drink their wine." The words cut like blades, revealing truths that everyone knew, but no one wanted to admit. It was as if Amos was tearing away the veil that hid the rottenness of the kingdom. He spoke with a strength that did not come from him but from God, and each sentence seemed to echo inside the consciences of those who listened. Some looked at each other uncomfortable. Others whispered, trying to diminish the importance of that simple man. But Amos continued, unfazed. He knew his message was a warning, a last call for Israel to change its ways. And his words, although difficult to hear, were just the beginning. While Amos's words were still echoing through the streets of Samaria, something deeper began to happen. God not only gave him words to speak, but also images that spoke for themselves, like living visions that pulsed before his eyes. The first came as a verdant field, which seemed prosperous and full of life, but suddenly a cloud of locusts appeared, devouring everything in its path. There was nothing left, no food, no hope. Amos felt the weight of that scene. He knew what it meant. Israel was on the brink of losing everything. Amos could not contain the outcry. He interceded, asking God to have mercy, not to completely destroy the people. And for a moment, it seemed like God had heard, but the visions continued. The next, fire appeared, not an ordinary fire, but something that consumed even the abysses, drying up the rivers and burning the earth to the roots. It was frightening, almost suffocating, as if Amos could feel the heat on his skin. Again he cried out, begging for mercy. But God was showing the seriousness of the situation, something that could no longer be ignored. The third vision was strangely simple, but loaded with meaning. Amos saw God holding a plumb line, that small instrument used by builders to ensure that a wall was built straight. But the plumb line was in the hands of the Creator, and he used it to measure Israel. The message was clear. The people were crooked, out of step. God, the builder of the universe, would not tolerate a moral edifice about to collapse. Amos's words were like an axe cutting at the roots of Israel's arrogance, and this bothered many people. Among those who felt threatened was Amaziah, the priest of Bethel. He was a powerful man, someone who represented the official religion of the kingdom. For Amaziah, the Bethel temple was more than a place of worship. It was a symbol of control and prestige. But now, that prophet coming from the south was shaking the structures, denouncing everything as false and corrupt. Amaziah knew he needed to do something, and quickly. The priest tried to disqualify Amos in every way possible. First, he sent a message to King Jeroboam, warning that Amos's prophecies were dangerous. He said, "Amos is plotting against you. His words are unbearable for the people." Amaziah wanted to make it appear that the prophet was a political threat, someone who was sowing revolt in the kingdom. But Amos was not intimidated. He knew that his mission came from God and not from the hands of men. When political pressure didn't work, Amaziah confronted Amos directly. He tried to be dismissive of him, as if his humble origins were cause for contempt. "Go away, seer," said Amaziah dismissively. "Go prophesy in Judah. Here in Israel you have no place." But Amos's words were like an unshakable rock. He looked at Amaziah and replied firmly, "I am neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. I am a cattle herder, a caretaker of sycamore trees. But the Lord took me from behind the flock and said, 'Go and prophesy to my people Israel.'" It was a powerful statement. Amos was not there by choice, nor by ambition. He was sent, and nothing, not even Amaziah, could divert him from his mission. But tensions continued to rise. Opposition to the prophet was increasingly strong, and the people began to divide between those who rejected him and the few who dared to listen to him. Amos's words, as sharp as blades, continued to echo through the palaces and markets of Israel. He stood up in the squares and said things that no one had the courage to say. One day, looking directly at the rich merchants who were showing off in their expensive robes, Amos began to speak with a tone that mixed indignation and regret. "You cows of Bashan," he said, referring to the elite women and men of Samaria. It was a bold, almost provocative metaphor, comparing them to the fat cows that grazed in the region of Bashan, known for their opulence. They lived in comfort, but at the expense of exploiting the poor. Amos described scenes of greed and oppression with stunning clarity. He spoke of dishonest scales in the markets, of traders who decreased the amount of wheat sold while increasing the price. He said that even the wheat waste, which should have been thrown away, was sold to the poorest as if it were food, and it didn't stop there. With a firm voice, he pointed the finger at the religious leaders who performed great ceremonies at the altars of Bethel and Gilgal, but whose hearts were far from God. I despise your religious festivals," proclaimed Amos, and the shock was palpable. He said that the sacrifices and songs that filled the temple were useless because they did not come from a righteous heart. Instead, he cried out, "Let justice roll down like a river, and righteousness like an everlasting stream." It was a powerful image, a metaphor that compared God's true will to a raging river that purifies and renews. The silence of the crowds was sometimes interrupted by uncomfortable murmurs or nervous laughter. Amos's message was becoming unbearable for the powerful, but he knew he needed to continue. There was more to be said, more to be revealed. Amos continued to speak, even in the face of resistance. He knew his words were harsh, but he also knew that God never sent a warning without a promise of hope. In the midst of his prophecies of destruction and judgment, Amos began to reveal something different. He spoke of a restoration, of a time when things would be put into place. It was as if, amidst the darkness of a starless night, he showed a glimmer of light on the horizon. "In that day," he said, "I will raise up David's fallen tent." It was a vision full of meaning. David's tent, a symbol of a simpler time and a purer relationship with God, would be restored. It would not be a temple of cold stones, but something alive, full of life and communion. Amos's words painted images that touched the hearts of even the most hardened. He spoke of vineyards full of fruit, of fertile fields where the grain would be so abundant that the harvesters could barely keep up. The days of hunger and scarcity would be replaced by a time of celebration and abundance. But it wasn't just that. Amos also spoke of a gathered people. Those who had been scattered, who had lost their roots, would be brought back. They would rebuild the destroyed cities, plant gardens, and live in peace. It was a promise that seemed impossible to many. After all, the reality before them was one of inequality, oppression, and imminent judgment. However, Amos' words were like a seed planted in hard ground, waiting for the right moment to germinate. Even as Amos held out this vision of hope, he knew that resistance continued to grow. People were restless, the powerful were more irritated. And while he spoke of a distant, restored future, the immediate reality was one of danger and uncertainty. His mission was reaching a critical point, and the approaching silence seemed even scarier than his words. After all that was said, after all the visions shared and truths proclaimed, Amos began to withdraw from the spotlight. His mission seemed to be coming to an end, but not because he had given up or lost his strength. It was as if, somehow, he knew he had already said everything he needed to say. The words that once roared like a lion now gave way to a silence that carried a weight greater than any speech. The people who heard him were divided. Some were still discussing his words, trying to understand what those promises and warnings meant. Others, especially the powerful, preferred to pretend that none of it mattered. "Who is he anyway?" they said to each other, trying to belittle the prophet who returned to the ways of Judah. But the truth is that Amos' impact was already recorded. His words continued to echo like waves that could not be contained. The absence of details about Amos' last days only adds to the mystery. He simply disappears from the pages of history, leaving no record of how his life ended. Perhaps he returned to the fields of Tekoa to take care of his sheep and fig trees, living out his remaining days in peace. Or perhaps he continued to proclaim his message, even in places where few could hear him. What we know is that the silence that followed was not an end, but an interval. It was as if his absence was part of the plan, a space left blank for the people to reflect and decide what to do with everything that had been said. Even so, the story of Amos did not disappear. His words remained alive, passing from generation to generation as a reminder of what justice, integrity, and the courage to obey God's call mean. Amos's words, although initially rejected by many, continued to spread like seeds thrown into the wind. His message, although simple in essence, contained a power so profound that it could not be ignored. Each sentence carried the strength of a conviction that came directly from God. He was no ordinary man. Even without titles or prophetic lineage, he left a mark that spanned generations. It was as if her story echoed beyond her own life, always challenging and inspiring. As time passed, the truths that Amos proclaimed became impossible to forget. The image of the plumb line, the river of justice, the cows of Bashan, all these metaphors were engraved in the people's memory, functioning as mirrors for a society that desperately needed change. And not just in Israel, but anywhere injustice and hypocrisy threatened to obscure God's will. Amos showed us that true worship is not in grand ceremonies or decorated temples, but in righteousness flowing like a river, in righteousness being practiced as a way of life. His voice was raised for those who had no voice, for the poor and oppressed who were exploited by the powerful. He personified the courage that comes from God's call, the courage to tell the truth, even when no one wants to hear it. To this day, Amos's legacy lives on, not just in his words, but in every act of justice, in every gesture of kindness that reflects the heart of God. Her story is a reminder that transformation begins in unexpected places, often with ordinary people. And as we reflect on his life, we ask ourselves, what are we doing to keep the river of justice flowing? Perhaps like Amos, we're being called to something greater, something that requires courage and faith to accomplish. And so, their story intertwines with ours, inviting us to listen, act, and transform the world around us. Amos' story ends as it began, without much fanfare, but with a strength that transcends time. He was just a shepherd, a man with calloused hands and feet marked by the dust of work in the fields, but he was chosen to carry a message that would shake a kingdom, not by his eloquence or position, but by his obedience and faith. And that's what makes his journey so powerful. Amos reminds us that God does not choose the capable. He empowers the chosen ones. From the hills of Tekoa to the squares of Samaria, Amos carried a lesson that echoes to this day. True worship of God lies in acts of justice and kindness. It doesn't matter how many songs we sing or how many altars we build. If our heart is not right and our actions are not fair, all of this is empty. He teaches us that faith is not something comfortable, but a call to face the most difficult realities, even if that means opposing what is popular or convenient. Furthermore, Amos challenges us to see the invisible. He spoke for the poor, the oppressed, the forgotten. He showed us that ignoring injustice does not absolve us of our responsibility. On the contrary, it makes us accomplices in it. His cry for a river of justice and a brook of righteousness was not just a cry to Israel, but a call to all of us in any time or place. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson of all. God can use anyone, anywhere, to fulfill his purposes. The only requirement is that we are willing to listen and act. Like Amos, we can be a voice for the voiceless, a channel for justice to flow. The question that remains is, are we ready to say yes to the call, even if it takes us down difficult paths? Because as Amos showed us, that yes is where the stories that really matter begin. If you like the story of the prophet Amos and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.